Okay, let's unpack this. You sent us down a really interesting rabbit hole with this whole concept of the Fourth Reich.
Mm-hmm.
We've got quite a bit of material here, that Wikipedia entry you mentioned, and yeah, it's pretty clear this term isn't just one simple thing, is it?
Not at all. It's loaded, loaded with history and used in, well, quite a few different ways.
So our mission today really is to dig into what the Fourth Reich actually signifies across these different sources we looked at.
Yeah, figure out where it came from, why it sticks around.
Exactly. And all the ways it's used,
Right.
from the really extreme stuff to like political arguments and even pop culture. Let's get into it.
Absolutely. And I think what's so fascinating right off the bat is just the power of that word Reich, empire, realm. It
Mhm.
has this historical weight. And that
Yes.
makes it such a potent symbol,
Mm.
easy to adapt, reinterpret. So to really get the Fourth Reich, maybe we should start with where this whole numbering thing even comes from.
Good point. Because
Oh.
Third Reich, we instantly think Nazi Germany, right?
Yeah.
1933 to 45. Hitler.
That's the immediate association for sure. But the term itself, well, it actually existed before the Nazis came along.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah, the groundwork was kind of laid by this guy, Arthur Muller von den Bruck. He wrote a book back in 1923 called Das Dritte Reich.
Das Dritte Reich.
Okay. And in it, he sort of framed German history as these stages, these realms. The First Reich, for him, that was the Holy Roman Empire, lasted, roughly 1,000 years.
Right.
The Second Reich, that was the German Empire, started in 1871.
Okay.
And the Third Reich, for Muller von den Bruck, this was like a future thing, an idealized state bringing together all German-speaking people, Austria included.
So it wasn't initially a Nazi concept at all. It was more like this romantic nationalist idea.
Exactly, kind of aspirational. But then, well, here's where it gets interesting, like you said. The Nazi Party grabbed onto that term, Third Reich,
Ah, okay.
and they used it strategically to, legitimize their own power grab.
So they presented themselves as the next logical step, the successors to these great historical empires.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It created this narrative of like historical continuity, destiny even.
Wow.
And that historical context, that's really key for understanding how the idea of a Fourth Reich even emerged. Because if you have a first, second, and
The
third...
question kind of asks itself, doesn't it? What would a fourth look like?
Exactly. And in its, let's say, initial and most literal sense, particularly in neo-Nazi circles, it was just that. A direct revival, a successor to the Third Reich's ideology.
Right. And looking at how neo-Nazis actually envision this Fourth Reich, based
Mhm.
on the info we have, it's pretty chilling. It's like a direct echo.
Yeah.
We're talking, Aryan supremacy, hardcore anti-Semitism, that Lebensraum expansion idea.
Aggressive militarism, totalitarian control.
All of it. The core tenets of Nazi ideology, basically.
Yeah, it's not surprising that people still holding those beliefs would want to see them resurrected in some future Fourth Reich.
And one really disturbing detail from the sources is this idea about nuclear weapons.
Yeah, that's particularly alarming.
The goal isn't just defense, is it? It's about what the source calls nuclear blackmail.
Right. Using that ultimate threat to force changes, to redraw borders, maybe get back to the 1937 lines, or even push beyond that.
It's a truly nightmarish scenario. And this wasn't just some fantasy confined to Europe, was it? This idea spread.
No, it definitely traveled. South America is a key place mentioned in the sources.
Ah, right. The post-war Nazi escapes.
Exactly. You had a lot of Nazi war criminals, high-ranking officials, sympathizers fleeing there after World War II. People like Otto Skorzeny, Hans-Ulrich Rudel,
Yeah?
figures who apparently stayed connected to these neo-Nazi networks.
Okay.
And for some of them, the ambition wasn't just hiding out. It was about potentially establishing a Fourth Reich there in South America, like an ideological base of operations.
Wow, a stronghold for a future comeback.
Yeah.
It really does sound like something out of a spy novel.
It absolutely does. And then there's this other concept mentioned, the Western Imperium. Where does that fit in?
Right, the Western Imperium.
This idea seems like it was influenced by thinkers like David Maia, sort of broadens the scope massively. It's not just about Germany coming back.
Okay, so bigger than Germany.
Yeah, the thinking is a Nazi revival in Germany could be the catalyst, the spark for a much larger, like pan-Aryan global empire.
Global.
Yeah. This Western Imperium would supposedly cover regions with large European-descended populations. So Europe, obviously, but also places like Russia, North America, Australia, parts of Africa even.
Whoa, that's a huge escalation from just reviving the Third Reich, its global racial dominance.
That's a massive ideological leap, yeah. But okay, so that's the more literal extreme end of the spectrum.
Right.
But the term Fourth Reich, as you mentioned, it takes on a totally different flavor when you look at how it's used in debates about, say, Germany's role in the European Union.
Totally different. Yeah, here it's used more like a metaphor, right?
Yeah.
And usually not in a flattering way.
Definitely not. It's often pejorative. Used by critics who feel Germany has, well, too much influence within the EU. It's less about literal Nazism and more about anxieties over economic or political power.
And the sources gave some pretty stark examples, like Simon Heffer in the Daily Mail.
Mm-hmm.
He talked about economic colonization of Europe by stealth.
Right. That phrase really jumps out.
He was basically arguing that Germany's economic muscle, especially after the financial crisis, gave it this dominant position, controlling other countries through economic pressure, not military force, and he explicitly called it the rise of the Fourth Reich.
Yeah, very direct language. And you had Simon Jenkins in The Guardian kind of touching on similar themes, maybe a bit more ironically, suggesting Europe was almost looking for German supremacy to solve its problems.
It taps into those historical anxieties about German power in Europe, doesn't it?
It really does. And it's interesting, Richard J. Evans, the historian writing in The New Statesman, he noted that this kind of language, the suspicion, hadn't really been seen much since German reunification.
Which also stirred up some similar fears back then. That underlying concern about Germany's size and influence in the middle of Europe, sometimes called Germanophobia, right?
Exactly. That term captures that specific kind of fear or distrust. But it's really important to stress, this view isn't universal.
No, definitely not.
The Economist's Charlemagne columnists, for instance, pushed back, arguing that the whole idea of German dominance or hegemony in the EU doesn't really stand up to scrutiny when you look at the actual power dynamics. It's more complex.
Sure, but the term itself clearly has punch, like that Italian newspaper Il Giornale.
Ah, yes, Quarter Reich.
Quarter Reich, Italian for Fourth Reich, splashed across their front page in 2012 as a protest against German influence.
Yeah, that's a bold move. And you definitely saw the term getting thrown around a lot more in the UK, didn't you? Especially around the Brexit referendum in 2016.
Oh, absolutely. Both leading up to it and afterwards.
Uh-huh.
Often used by people arguing to leave the EU.
It really shows how that label, Fourth Reich, can become this really potent, emotionally charged symbol in fights over national sovereignty.
Yeah. For the Leave side, it kind of represented this fear of losing control to Brussels, with Germany often painted as the puppet master, you know?
And it wasn't just media commentators using it either. We saw politicians getting in on it too.
Yeah.
Like Jarosław Kaczyński in Poland.
Right, the Polish deputy prime minister.
Yeah.
In 2021, he accused Germany of trying to turn the EU into a federal German Fourth Reich. That made big waves.
It did, and what's really interesting there is how he framed it. He linked the supposed Fourth Reich back to the Holy Roman Empire, the First Reich.
Not directly to the Nazis.
Not directly to the Nazis, no.
Right.
Which suggests his main beef wasn't really about, a resurgence of fascism, but more about this push towards greater EU federalism.
Which he saw as Germany leading the charge and Poland losing sovereignty.
Exactly. It just shows how that word Reich, even detached from Hitler, can still trigger these deep-seated historical fears about centralized power and losing national identity.
Okay, so that's the EU context. But then there's this third way the term gets used, talking about the rise of right-wing populism more broadly.
Yes, that's another distinct usage. You see commentators, often on the left, drawing parallels between current right-wing populist movements and, well, the rise of fascism back in the 20s and 30s.
So using Fourth Reich as a kind of warning.
Pretty much. Highlighting perceived similarities maybe in rhetoric, ideology, or potential threats to democracy. It's used to sound an alarm.
The Wikipedia entry had that really striking example from James Baldwin way back in 1973.
Oh, yeah, that was powerful.
Talking about Richard Nixon's re-election in the context of race issues in America.
Yeah.
And calling it the arrival of the Fourth Reich.
Yeah, using it in a purely American political context, linking it to oppression, injustice.
Yeah.
It really shows the symbolic power of the term to evoke authoritarianism, the loss of rights, even when there's no direct link to Germany or neo-Nazism itself.
It's incredibly potent.
It is. But there's a necessary caution here, right? The historian Gabriel Rosenfeld brings this up.
Okay, what's the caution?
Well, basically that we need to be careful with these historical comparisons. Making overly dramatic, hyperbolic links between current figures and, say, Hitler.
Can actually backfire.
Yeah, it can risk trivializing the actual historical horrors of the Holocaust in Nazi Germany. and maybe even make us less alert to real emerging threats if we cry wolf too often or too loudly.
That's a really important point. Nuance matters, especially with language this loaded. Okay, so we've got the neo-Nazi vision, the EU critique, the populist warning,
Yeah.
and then there's popular culture.
Ah, yeah, pop culture loves this stuff.
It seems like the idea of a Fourth Reich has just completely permeated fiction, hasn't it? Films, TV, books, comics, games.
Oh, absolutely. It's fertile ground for drama, for thrillers, for sci-fi even.
Yeah.
Get some really wild interpretations.
Like Iron Sky, right? The movie with the Nazis on the moon.
Exactly. That's kind of a satirical, over-the-top take. Nazis escaping to the dark side of the moon, plotting their comeback.
Classic. And then you have something more serious, like The Boys from Brazil.
Right, the thriller based on cloning Hitler. Creating these little Hitlers scattered around the world, hoping one will rise up and, start it all again. Chilling idea.
And TV's done it too. I remember that old Mission Impossible episode.
Yeah, from the 60s, about finding Hitler's hidden treasure meant to fund a new Fourth Reich.
Right. And more recently, that show Hunters.
Hunters. Depicting Nazi leaders hiding out in South America, actively plotting a Fourth Reich, and it even throws in the idea that Hitler and Eva Braun might still be alive down there.
It really plays on those enduring fears and, frankly, fascination surrounding the Nazis.
Definitely. And literature's full of it, too. Robert Ludlum's thrillers, like The Holcroft Covenant or The Apocalypse Watch.
Yeah, Ludlum loved those kinds of plots. Secret Nazi organizations working behind the scenes.
Exactly. Trying to establish a Fourth Reich through infiltration, manipulation, and Ira Levin's The Boys from Brazil novel, same core idea as the film.
Even comics. You mentioned 2000 AD.
Yeah, the British comic had a storyline called The Schicklgruber Grab, where Hitler fakes his death to escape and secretly set up a Fourth Reich. Again, pretty outlandish, but shows the concept's reach.
And video games, too. It feels like it's everywhere.
It really is. Call of Duty. Vanguard had elements of a Nazi government in exile, a post-Hitler regime. The Metro games have that faction, literally called the Fourth Reich, obsessed with genetic purity in the post-apocalypse.
Wow.
And even strategy games like Hearts of Iron IV, where you can have alternate history paths. Argentina becoming the Fourth Reich under Hitler's influence. Stuff like that.
It just demonstrates how deeply embedded this idea is in our kind of collective imagination.
Yeah.
It's become this shorthand for ultimate evil or this threat that's always lurking.
A very potent symbol.
So, yeah, okay, wrapping this up.
Yeah.
What does all this mean for you listening to this? We've seen the Fourth Reich isn't one thing. It's used literally by some very fringe groups. It's used figuratively, often as criticism in political and economic debates, especially in Europe. And it's used dramatically, often fantastically, in fiction. But here's where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yeah.
When you look across all these uses, the sources really highlight how the shadow of the past, specifically Nazi Germany, just continues to shape how we talk about and understand the present.
That's absolutely true. The term acts like this historical alarm bell.
Yeah. Whether it's neo-Nazis dreaming of it or commentators warning about German power or a sci-fi movie, it forces us to think about the Third Reich, but also about our current anxieties. Power, influence, ideology, it all gets wrapped up in it.
It's a loaded term precisely because it connects history to present fears.
So it leaves you with this thought, maybe a provocative one. How often does the language we use today, maybe even unconsciously, echo these historical fears, not just about the Fourth Reich, but other things too? And, what are the implications when our current debates are haunted by the ghosts of the past?